Tali is an internationally exhibited interdisciplinary artist and weaver. She combines plant fibers and dyes with plastics and data to explore relationships between ecological and human health. Her work is in the collections of the Berkeley Art Museum, Denver Botanic Gardens, and Georgia Museum of Art, and has been featured in the Fish National Climate Assessment, the New York Times, Colossal, and RDC's On Earth magazine, amongst others. She is a recipient of the Illinois Artist Fellowship, a Tulsa Artist Fellowship, and in numerous residencies, including New York's Museum of Art and Design, and she holds a BA and MA from the New York University and an MFA from the California College of Arts. I forgot to say that if you can turn off your cell phones, that would be excellent. And also, if you need to leave before we're done with questions and answers, to just try to do that very quietly and stay if you can. And then finally, this series is a collaboration with the Cleve Carney Museum of Art, as well as the photography, architecture, fine arts, and interior design departments. And we have another lecture coming up, so look out for that. With no further ado, I'd love to introduce Tali to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. So thank you so much, Mara, and the College of DuPage and the museum for hosting me this week. So my talk this morning is in 3 parts. I'm going to share the evolution of 2 long-term projects that attend in different ways to the interconnected harms that extraction inflicts on humans and the earth. So from rising temperatures, species loss, and plastic proliferation to illness. And the first is a project that I've come to think of as a feminist material archive of climate data. And the second is a project on human-tree relationships that includes research that was done at the Morton Arboretum down the road from here. In both of these projects, I use intimate hand processes like weaving, dyeing, and coiling to explore grief, care, and possibility within the context of intertwined health and climate crises. And so I'm going to start first, before jumping into the work, by talking a bit about the role that materiality and the process of weaving play in this work. So numerous feminist, indigenous, and environmental scholars have pointed to the harms that come when we see ourselves as separate from others and from the world around us, including the multitude of harms that adds up to climate crisis. Feminist philosopher Donna Haraway, for one, tells us that it matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. So the structures and the narratives that we use shape our understandings of the world and the actions that we take and the systems that we create, and vice versa. So the language that most of us in this room use day to day is one that actually lends itself to describing the world in binaries and separate categories, which of course has utility, but also limitations. People with power benefit when these relationships between self and other, or humans and nature, or here and there, are obscured. So part of the work of addressing ecological crises is retracing those relationships. You may have actually heard others refer to weaving as a binary language, and that alludes to computing's binary code of zeros and ones in relationship to the weaving binary of whether a vertical thread is passing over or under a horizontal thread. But weaving for me has actually never felt binary. The outcome of the cloth has as much to do with the weight, the texture, and the color of the yarn, the space between the threads, and the hand of the weaver as it does with whether a warp thread is up or down in a weaving draft. So instead, I see weaving as a language of intersections and relationships, from the crossing of hundreds of threads to the ways that cloth connects us to each other and to the world. In this way, weaving is the story to tell the story with, as Donna Haraway would say. Tracing the relationships that are embodied in weaving is a way to retrace and reimagine relationships between corporeal and ecological bodies, between individual and collective experiences, and between grief and possibility. So weaving is relational socially, ecologically, metaphorically, and tactily. One could view weaving as an isolated studio practice, but for me, it's an embodied practice that I've always felt has situated me in the world, one that's dependent on the functioning of complex ecosystems, of water and soil and insects, of the laborers who cultivate and manufacture and transport materials that I use, the activists and the scientists that inform the work, and much more. And I think of each material as being embedded with its own kind of ecological and social histories that contribute to the meaning of the work. So textile histories are histories of social justice and injustice. They've been significant sites of labor exploitation and sites of resistance, whether that's slavery on cotton and indigo plantations, the fossil fuel dependence of the Industrial Revolution, the role of khadi cloth in Gandhi's resistance to British colonialism, women-led labor struggles, or today's fiber sheds. And finally, weaving is integral to practices of grieving and care, whether that's the ritual repetition of the process, or the shrouds, prayer shawls, blankets, and other textiles that result. So weaving then is a relational, an affective, and an embodied language, one that lends itself to the expressions of care, grief, resistance, and remaking that are necessary for grappling with the confluence of climate, health, and social crises that we're facing. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on 2 long-term projects. I started making work about climate crisis in 2015, weaving the first pieces of what would become a decade-long project that I refer to really broadly as the climate datascapes. So each datascape starts with climate data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and I'm materializing the data as weavings and as coiled sculptures using plant fibers and dyes, as well as petrochemical-derived medical tubing and fishing line. There are now 14 series and dozens of works within this larger project. I'm just going to talk about a handful of them today. But I will start at the beginning. So the very first datascapes were a response to the drought in what was then my home in California, and my awareness that the drought, as one local manifestation of climate crisis, exacerbated existing injustices and disproportionately harmed those already marginalized. And as I researched the drought, I became increasingly interested in how we come to understand climate crisis, whether that's embodied experience, narrative journalism, or as has become my focus, data. And so these 8 pieces from 2015 are titled, "It's Not Just About the Rain." The 6 squares to the left are 120 years of temperature data for California, and the pair on the right are 120 years of precipitation data for California. And the title was like a retort to the ways that the drought was often being spoken about. So it's not just about the rain, it's about the effects of warming temperatures. It's not just about the rain, it's about the underlying structures that make it possible for fields that are growing food for the wealthy to be green, while neighboring families' wells are dry and they can't afford to buy water. But these pieces were woven in a really different political moment. So I viewed these early datascapes more as a critique of data visualization. Data is a relatively patriarchal, Western, capitalist, and colonial form of knowledge. It condenses a vast amount of time and labor and knowledge from across disciplines into a really quickly digestible form. This is incredibly valuable, but it's also its own kind of abstraction, because when you select what is communicated, other things are stripped away, in this case, including the personal and political dimensions of the climate crisis. So weaving's mathematical patterning and connections to computing lends itself quite well to data translation, while its materiality and relational qualities that I talked about a few minutes ago communicate in ways that the numerical data cannot. So weaving for me became a way to reinsert some of that time and labor and sense of place, embodied experience and social relations that are otherwise obscured when viewing climate solely as data. And the resulting abstract color fields become these spaces to reflect on what you can't see in the data itself. So, of course, from 2016 on, a lot changed. And so the project also evolved in response to increasing threats to bodies and ecosystems and climate data in the face of leaders who were prioritizing extraction over everything else. In January of 2017, along with this political shift, I had moved from Berkeley, California to Tulsa, Oklahoma for a fellowship. And I arrived shortly before that year's presidential inauguration. The change in political administration had jeopardized the collection and safekeeping of climate knowledge. And like today, scientists and activists were rushing to preserve data that they knew was at risk of erasure. I was unsure of what my next project would be, but I decided to just follow their lead and copy the content of the one NOAA database that I had used for my work in California. And it was immersing myself in that data that brought the questions and the stories to my attention, which would guide my work for the coming years. So from 2016 forward, the weavings became not just a critique of data, but also a way to attend to the data's materiality, value, and vulnerability. The data became like a kind of a scaffold, and I make choices about material and form and color to explore personal relationships to place and to reinsert social, political dimensions of the climate crisis back into the story that the data tells. I made a number of the datascapes while in Tulsa between 2017 and 2019. I'm going to share thematically rather than chronologically from this point forward, since a lot of them are sort of developed in conversation with each other, simultaneous to each other. So the dislocations weavings, our interpretation, which you're looking at here, are interpretations of temperature data for a place that I once called home, interwoven with temperature data for the world's oceans. I don't see the datascapes as charts, but I also know that there's always curiosity about that translation process. So I'm going to use dislocations as a quick example of how that works. So after copying the data into a spreadsheet, I rank the coolest to warmest years, if I'm using temperature data specifically, and then apply different colors and patterns to numbers on the scale. I then color code the data with organic cotton that's been dyed with plant and insect-derived dyes and mineral mordants. In the dislocation series, each piece comprises 2 data sets. So there's temperature for a place I've called home, and temperature for the oceans. So it's one line of data dyed thread from the state, and one from the oceans, and one from the state, and one from the oceans. And I'm interweaving the data sets. And as I do, we're sort of reflecting on how human life on land harms the oceans and how rising ocean temperatures in turn affect everyone, whether on the coast or inland. Oceans have been absorbing a lot of the carbon and the heat that we've been creating in the world. And oceans also hold a lot of our current climate solutions. So the colors and the patterns are based on my memories and connotations of each home's landscape. Industrial agriculture's cornfields that pervade central Illinois, which used to be prairie. New York City's gridded streets and skyscrapers. The hills of central California that went from year-round flowers to seemingly year-round fires by the time I had left. And Oklahoma's iconic red dirt. My move to Tulsa, Oklahoma, a place that's still economically and culturally tethered to fossil fuel extraction, brought me up close to the oil and gas industry and the embodied experience of living in a place that extraction has made toxic. And so this weaving fault lines is comprised of between 94 and 125 years of temperature data for each of the top 6 oil extracting states in the US, Texas, North Dakota, Alaska, California, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And the dimensions are 9.5 feet by 5 feet, which mimics the size of the burial flags that we use to drape US military coffins. And the reason for that, so at the same time that politicians were threatening the production and the safekeeping of climate knowledge, they were also expanding fossil fuel extraction, even as more and more of us at that point were personally experiencing climate crisis in our lives. In 2018, the US became the world's largest oil and gas extractor in the world. We still are today. There is no energy crisis. And it's a title that's achieved through the use of ever more harmful methods like fracking and deep water drilling. And then politicians would justify the violence of extraction using the same patriotic language that was used to justify wars. So referencing burial flags, this piece nods to that patriotic justification for this violence while attending to extraction's many casualties, human and non-human, inside and outside of the industry. So combing through the hundreds of data sets that I'd copied from the NOAA database in January of 2017, this is like an Excel spreadsheet with some conditional formatting to show some of those data sets very quickly. But I was really struck by how much clearer at the time the progression of warming was at the larger geographic scales, which are the central, wider columns in this image. Our individual experiences of the climate crisis are vastly unequal, and they're shaped by intersections of human-caused climate change with race, gender, class, disability, geography, and policy. But while our local and personal experiences have been unjustly different, we're all still materially bound together in this crisis. And so that spreadsheet was the starting point for Bound, which is an ever-changing sculpture comprised of climate data for 300 places around the globe that's been materialized as 1,500 feet of petrochemical-derived medical tubing that's divided into 5 to 6 foot lengths. And then the tubes are wrapped with plant and insect-dyed cotton that's color-coding the data. Each tube is temperature data for a different city, state, or region of the world. So while oil and gas pipelines run through the earth, these petrochemical-derived medical tubes are pipelines that run through and around our bodies. They could be used for chemo drug delivery or other treatments for illnesses that often have the same causes as climate crisis. So Bound is a materialization in my mind of these different kinds of entanglements with fossil fuels, with each other, and with the earth, air, and water. Coiling all of those tubes took about 2 years. And so over that time, I exhibited the sculpture iteratively, thinking of each installation as a way to reflect on different aspects of climate crisis. So it's been shown as a knot of oil and gas pipelines crisscrossing a landscape, a carpet of prairie grasses, a river, and like in this piece for the Center for Craft in Asheville in 2018, the swirl of a storm moving across a weather map. I had conceived the form for Bound I2, the second iteration, in response to a particularly horrific 2017 hurricane season that had devastated Puerto Rico and the Texas coast. And then it was coincidentally installed in Asheville, North Carolina, just as Hurricane Florence was swamping the state in 2018. So this fall, I decided to install this storm map iteration of Bound again at a gallery in Milwaukee. It's on view right now, just as like a small gesture to remember the devastation of Hurricane Helene in Asheville and the surrounding area 1 year ago. Reaching far beyond the coastlines, Helene demonstrated just how few of us are actually out of harm's reach now, 8 years after starting Bound. And also a reminder, an example that art and culture, as well as climate data, are all vulnerable to climate crisis. So that screenshot on the side there was taken last fall, talking about an outage on NOAA's website. So Asheville is actually where NOAA's main data center is located, and the hurricane had left it inaccessible. And actually for a while, folks didn't know what had been damaged or lost versus just unavailable for a time. But it was really another reminder of the materiality and the vulnerability of climate data itself. So as I immersed myself in the NOAA data that I'd copied in 2017, I was also interested in how the data was aggregated, primarily along politically defined borders. So how the data is aggregated is shaped by power structures and stories about our world, and how the data is aggregated then shapes the stories that it can and cannot tell. So I was trying to seek out an alternative relationship to place, one that's feminist and anti-colonial and anti-capitalist. And so I found myself drawn again and again to the few data sets that were shaped more by the Earth itself than by humans, so namely the oceans and later on watersheds. So I wove a number of pieces from ocean data over the years. In more recent works like this one, Heat Waves, I brought together my attention to water with my attention to extraction and pollution. So the strands of dyed linen warp threads, the vertical threads, in heat waves color code temperature data for the Earth's surface, one side land and one side oceans. Weaving involves two sets of intersecting threads, the warp that's held under tension by the loom, and the weft which a weaver inserts between warps. The warp threads are an underlying structure on which the cloth is built, and as rigid as these structures are, the weaver still has agency with many possibilities of color and pattern and material available as they work within the structure. In the earlier datascapes, I had woven so that the warp, that underlying structure of the cloth, was completely hidden underneath the weft, and the color-coded data in the weft is obscuring what's beneath it, which I thought about as kind of a metaphor for everything else that's obscured when we're seeing climate change solely as data. In Heat Waves, which I showed a second ago, and then also in this piece from 2025, I instead encode the data in the warp, in that underlying structure, reflecting on how much more entrenched climate crisis has begun since weaving the first datascapes. So this materialization of rising temperatures then in the dyed linen warp is held together with transparent petrochemical derived fishing line in the weft, leaving the warp structure fully visible. So the fishing line's reflective quality evokes the shimmering surface of a body of water, while the woven patterns mimic waves. And visitors who encounter heat waves or this piece in a gallery view each other through these semi-transparent textiles to connect rising temperatures and plastics to their impact on the body. So I had returned to this approach in my most recent Datascape commission for a show at BEMA's Center for Contemporary Arts this summer. This woven installation is composed of 130 years of temperature data for the Missouri River Basin, the Upper Mississippi River Basin, the Great Lakes Basin, and the Ohio River Basin. All again color-coded as plant and insect dyed linen. And then again, this materialization of rising temperatures is woven together with the petrochemical derived fishing line. In this series titled Silt Studies, each piece starts with climate data for one of the major river basins in the US. And I move between these processes of concealing and revealing the warp. So in the NOAA database that I draw from, the organization has a few different ways of dividing the continental US into regions. There are political borders like states. There are regions defined by capitalist exchange like agricultural commodities. And then there are river basins. And the river basins are areas of land where all precipitation drains into the same body of water. So they're areas of land defined by the earth itself and defined in relation to rather than separate from water. NOAA divides the continental US into 18 major river basins, each of which are made up of lots of smaller watersheds that feed into them. So a river basin is a type of watershed. And these river basins, the data about these river basins has really been the focus of all of my data-based work since 2021. So in the silt studies, I interweave the color-coded cotton with the fishing line. So one line of data-dyed cotton and one of plastic fishing line and one of data and one of plastic. And so while the data-dyed cotton is concealing the warp, that underlying structure below, the warp that's below the transparent fishing line remains visible, bending and curving like a river. So the sort of curving vertical beige thread so that you can see there. And the series title references the tiny particles of eroded rocks and minerals that are carried by flowing water and deposited elsewhere as sediment. So when ecosystems are polluted, silt becomes destructive, transporting the toxins it's exposed to as it moves from one part of a watershed to another. So river basins are places that are defined by flows and connections. showing the impossibility of separating ourselves from each other or the earth. As the detritus of our human life on land runs downstream and then circulates back through our bodies, river basins embody the interdependence of ecological and human health. This sculpture starts with temperature data for the 18 major river basins in the continental US, and it's been materialized as plant and insect dyed cotton. And this time the data dyed cotton is coiled along these bundles of plastic medical tubing, which twist through each other and are then bound at points where temperature data for multiple places aligns. All of the river basins eventually flow together at the top of the sculpture as they share the consequences of our present-day heated planet. Started in 2023 during what was at the time the hottest months of the hottest year on record. This piece, Heat Waves, Waterfalls, again, connects extreme temperatures to their impacts on the human body. So I think about the plastic medical tubing as an expression of the impact of extraction and plastic pollution on our bodies and our waterways, while wrapping and bundling the tubes by hand also became an expression of care for our interconnected lives. Okay, so concurrent with the Datascapes project, switching gears, I've developed another body of work exploring the multidimensional relationships between humans and trees. Trees are vital parts of our immune systems, climate systems, knowledge systems, support systems, and circulatory systems. And like us, they're also increasingly vulnerable to the fossil fuel and chemical intensive systems that we live within. In January of 2018, I had attended an artist residency in Caldera in the Pacific Northwest. And in my daily hikes at Caldera, I found myself drawn over and over again to these stands of dead trees that stood like skeletons, stripped clean by time. So about a decade before my arrival, the landscape had been scarred by a wildfire. And I was struck in particular by one group of these trees that were seemingly like reaching their arms towards the sky and towards each other and towards their fellow trees laying at their feet. The tree images didn't make their way into the work that I was doing at the residency, but my experience of this fire-worn landscape had stayed with me. So I weave the datascapes that I showed you on a floor loom in my studio, which is the first image on the left. This next body of work, the tree-related work, is woven on something that's called a thread controller, or a TC2 digital jacquard loom, which is a unique hybrid tool that allows me to weave imagery and complex combinations of patterns with the assistance of a computer while still maintaining the intimate process of hand weaving. I don't have regular access to these looms, instead relying on residencies and visiting artist positions at universities to develop this project. And so it's been interspersed throughout other work over the last 6 years. But in 2019, 15 months after my residency at Caldera, I had an opportunity to use the digital jacquard loom at the University of Colorado Boulder. And that's where I completed my first material explorations of these trees. In that case, weaving them as these sort of like dark figures, arms reaching and foregrounding fire and smoke-filled skies. The weavings start with imagery rather than numerical data like in the datascapes. But like in the datascapes, I'm still using color and material and structure to embed content in form and to try to evoke places that have been transformed by climate crisis. So in the stretch of time between 2019, when I wove those first trees, and late 2021, which is when I next had access to one of these digital jacquard looms, my work with climate data had coalesced around those relationships between extraction and illness and climate crisis. I had started incorporating the plastic medical tubing and the fishing line into my work to draw out those connections between the damage that extraction does to the earth and our bodies. And my work with river basin data had led me to reflect on relationships between life-sustaining circulatory systems inside and outside of the human body. So from lungs and arteries to rivers and forests. And that accumulated research was front of mind when I finally returned to the tree imagery again in 2021. The series is titled Memories of Future Fires. All of these pieces start with the same photos of the dead trees in Caldera, but this time around, I'm materializing the photos using black cotton as the warp and then plastic monofilament as the weft in order to weave together these reflections on fire and smoke and microplastics, and also thinking about grieving what's already lost while anticipating future loss. Memories of Future Fires for me is a tactile interweaving of the circulatory systems of corporeal and ecological bodies. And so I was focusing on compositions in which the tree shapes could allude to hearts and lungs. The trees themselves are woven as these silhouettes of really dense textured threads, and then these opaque areas are set against these like porous, semi-transparent patterned backgrounds, which up close reference cells and flames. Trees are vital to human and ecosystem health, sequestering carbon, controlling temperatures, and mitigating pollution. We learn as kids that breathing is an interconnected act, that trees are counterparts to our own breath, inhaling CO2 and exhaling oxygen as we exhale CO2 and inhale oxygen, which also means that when trees die, so do we. But as both we and trees breathe, we also encounter particulates, including microplastics. As toxicants accumulate in the air, they also accumulate in our bodies, leading to accumulations of illnesses like cancers, endocrine disorders, and respiratory and cardiovascular disease. So I used the monofilament to create these kind of like ghostly bodies that were forms that were resonant for me as I was reflecting on loss and the anticipation of future loss in the context of fire and climate crisis. The weaving's porosity also alludes to the often unacknowledged porosity of our own bodies, physically inseparable from our environment. As blood moves oxygen through our bodies, it's also circulating the toxicants we encounter, whether that's the smoke from fires, microplastics, or other dangerous chemicals. And so then weaving with this petrochemical-derived monofilament, the trees also become materializations of this invisible buildup in our bodies and our ecosystems. After completing Memories of Future Fires, I continued my research on trees and extraction and pollution and health, and I came across these two headlines published just a couple months apart that point to the sort of eerily parallel harms that extraction and the burning of fossil fuels inflicts on trees and humans. So while 1 in 6 tree species in the continental US was threatened due to human-caused environmental stressors, 1 in 6 human deaths in the preceding years of these headlines could be directly traced to pollution. And since trees clean the air and are vital to human health, these crises are inextricable. So I was drawn to the parallel statistics of 1 in 6, and I decided to document living examples of endangered tree species, starting with 6 species that had once had a presence in my home state of Illinois: American elm, American chestnut, white ash, blue ash, pumpkin ash, and butternut. The list also originally included green ash trees, but I hadn't found any living green ash trees in the area. So I took a lot of these photos at Chicago's Morton Arboretum, which is also an organization at the forefront of endangered species research, if that's something that's interesting to you. And then I would edit the digital images to create these silhouettes that also allude to the human body, to roots, and to watersheds. At the end of 2023, I was invited to work on a digital jacquard loom at Berea College in Kentucky, and that's where I wove the first of these critically endangered species. When I arrived on campus, I learned that Berea's foresters were part of a larger effort to try to revive the American chestnut, which is a species that had once been prevalent on the forested land and that now belongs to the school. American chestnuts are considered functionally extinct, so they don't mature enough to reproduce or to produce the wood and the fruit that humans once used. But when I was walking through the land with one of the foresters, I was intrigued to learn that American chestnuts do continue to live as root systems. So the blight that attacks the trees, that those orange specks, doesn't kill the roots. So as a shoot above ground begins to die from the blight, the roots then send up a new shoot, and that's a cycle that can continue indefinitely. So the knowledge of their surviving root systems was intriguing to me, and sort of approached this asking the questions of, like, how should this shift my understanding of the life and value of a species? Like, what does it mean to be extinct? What does it mean to persist in the world? And so I was weaving the chestnuts to reflect on these questions, and I wove them upside down, thinking of them as roots, like lungs and arteries, often invisible parts of circulatory systems that enable visible life. In arterial forest, which is the name of the series, the weft is monofilament, again, that plastic, and the warp threads are undyed organic cotton. So I chose the white and the natural colored cotton for these semi-transparent pieces, thinking about another kind of white semi-transparent cotton cloth, gauze. So a reference connecting the work to practices of wound care. And then their size closer to that of a human body than to a full-grown tree, references shrouds. So a different kind of textile connected to practices of loss and grief. The second set of weavings that I completed at Berea were of American elms, and I was drawn to these silhouettes that I'd photographed because they were most evocative of lungs, and my choice of the blues and the greens in the details of the monofilament weft and the flowing structures in the background were connected to my reflections on breath and air. So weaving with monofilament means that the warp, that underlying structure of the cloth, remains fully visible. And I think about tangibly revealing these usually invisible woven structures as weaving a material metaphor for other unseen interconnected structures embodied in the work. Circulatory systems like roots and lungs, the microplastics we breathe, and the systems tethering us to fossil fuels. Right, so on my visits to the Morton Arboretum, I was photographing living examples of white ash and blue ash and pumpkin ash, and chestnuts and elms, but I didn't find living examples of green ash trees. So I would follow the Morton Arboretum's maps to the listed sites, and either there would be nothing or I would find a dead tree, which is really easy to identify because of the burrowed patterns that are left by the emerald ash borer larvae on the trees. So the ash borer is an invasive beetle introduced to the US sometime before 2002, and since then it has spread widely. Dead ash trees have been pervasive throughout my hometown in Illinois and much of the eastern half of the US, and certainly Chicago. The borer kills the trees by burrowing into the inner bark, which then cuts off the tree's circulatory system so that the water and the nutrients can't reach the crown. And so I now have dozens of photos of these scars on my phone. Many were taken in parks near where I grew up, some at the Arboretum where I was seeking out living trees, and others elsewhere in the US when I traveled for residencies. So these kind of like winding thread-like lines really always draw me in. And the beetle itself is also captivating. It's got these iridescent emerald green wings and a body that's like copper and red and magenta. They're strangely beautiful in the same way that the shimmering plastic monofilament is beautiful, a beauty that I know actually indicates harm. So I spent the fall of 2024 as a visiting artist at the University of Missouri, and I had intended to spend my time continuing to weave living examples of endangered tree species on their TC2 loom, on their jacquard loom. Partway through the semester, though, in November last year, I found my focus shifting from the living trees to tending the dead. As a way of processing the images that I'd collected and the state of the world, I began tracing the ash borer larva scars. The looping, coiling lines reminded me of thread. They also remind me of emerald green oxygen tubing, which was something I knew intimately from my mom's hospice care. The oxygen tubes, an intervention for a faltering circulatory system, are very similar in color to the shiny green insect wings. So to materialize the drawings, I enlarge them to human scale and then weave the larva scars in plastic and the patterned grounds in linen and cotton with both plant and petrochemical derived dyes, dyed with both plant and petrochemical derived dyes. In many, the scars are green, alluding to the wings and to the oxygen tubing. And in others, the trails are woven in safety orange and blood red. These are just a handful of details. This is still very much a project in process. But when I began researching relationships between endangered tree species and human health several years earlier, one of the first studies I actually found was on the effect of the emerald ash borer, because scientists can trace a really direct connection from the ash borer infestations to the die-off of trees to the increasing deaths from humans from cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. Poor air quality and stress are risk factors for both of those things, and we know trees improve air quality and reduce stress. Ashes are some of the most common urban trees, making up, for example, nearly a fifth of Chicago's urban forest. And in such large numbers, they've played a really vital role in mitigating rising temperatures and countering pollution. So here I use safety orange on black and white to reference this direct line that scientists trace from ash die-off in cities to human cardiovascular and respiratory deaths. The colors that you see in the woven scars are primarily from the color of the warp that's visible through the transparent monofilament weft. So the warp is these like red, orange, gold, or the greens. And so it's again that underlying structure that's being revealed in the areas where the ash borer has carved away. I think of weaving as a way of exploring intersecting systems and structures. Weaving is a series of intersecting systems and structures. It's a way to trace and maybe even reimagine relationships. It is the story to tell the story with, as Donna Haraway says. And so I ask myself, what's the story here? Looking at the plastic weft pushing the cotton warp back and forth, one could view these weavings purely as stories for how extraction and plastics shape our lives. But there's another metaphor as well, another story about relationships in and to the world that I take from doing this work. My practice is a way for me to try to make sense of and stay engaged with the world, to connect with others who are working towards alternate futures, and to create space for grief, care, as well as the possibility of remaking. So a warp under tension on the loom gives the impression of rigidity. One can see below the monofilament that the warp is actually much less rigid than initially perceived. The weft, the threads that are controlled by the hand of a weaver, push and pull the warp at each intersection. So weaving is an embodied practice of attending to interconnectedness, and woven cloth is made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of these intersections, thousands of relationships. And at each of these intersections, at each push and pull, there is flexibility amidst perceived rigidity and possibility amidst constraint. At each point of connection in the systems that we navigate, possible futures are made. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Okay, we can take a couple of questions. If you have questions, you can raise your hand. Yeah. Go ahead.
How often does it take for you to make these pieces? Or like, how long does it take?
Oh, it varies. I don't have a good answer to that. It also depends on where you start the clock, right? Like, do you start with the research? If you're talking about the data, do you start with the data translation and finding the data? Do you take into account the amount of time that it takes to dye the threads and wind the yarn into balls and warp the loom? So there isn't really a good way of us measuring individually.
What came first for you, the science of studying all this, or were you a weaver to begin with?
So the thing that came first was the importance of like, social and climate justice to me. I became a weaver about 15 years ago, and my career before that had been in more of like the social justice and human rights realm. And weaving was really interesting to me in part because it connected to all of these other issues, and I saw it as a good way of exploring some of these other issues materially and artistically. And a lot of the research it's all iterative. So I become interested in a thing, and then I ask some questions, and I make something, and that making of something raises new questions, and I need to go out and learn something else. And then it sort of builds on itself.
So with petrochemical tubing, you said that there's a relationship between how that affects climate change, where it's like things are pumped into it and like change things, right? Like, or how would you define the connection between the petrochemical tubing and climate change?
Okay. Yeah. So the medical tubing is plastic, right? And plastic is a petrochemical derived material, so connected to fossil fuels. And the first way I started thinking about it when I was in Oklahoma and sort of grappling with like what I felt was the embodied experience of living in this toxic place, this place that had been made toxic by fossil fuels. So there are pipelines everywhere. They run through and around the earth, and they transport fossil fuels. And then there are these tubes, these pipelines that are made out of plastic that run through and around our bodies. And so that was one way of thinking about the connection between our bodies and the earth. Also thinking about just like how this isn't a critique of medicine. I think that there are some good uses for plastic here, but like the ways that we are so entangled that this sometimes the system it feels so inextricable, right? But also that the medical tubing is used for interventions in illnesses that often have the same causes as climate crisis. So when we think about cancers and endocrine disorders and all sorts of other things, they have a relationship to the things that are causing rising temperatures and droughts and fires and all of it.
So, I guess what I was really curious about is how those medical tubings actually tie into the hurricane piece that you were doing.
So each length of tubing is coiled with color-coded data, so the climate data from NOAA that I use. And each length of tubing, it's a different data set. It's temperature data for a different place in the world. So there were 300 total eventually, but I would show the piece iteratively because it took several years to complete it. So in the hurricane-related piece, there were 32 tubes that I had arranged in this sort of like swirl, looks a little bit, or to me it was evocative of the swirl of a storm moving across a map. And so it's the temperature data that you're seeing and the medical tubing that is making up that storm map. Does that get a little bit closer to what you meant?
Yeah, I guess I'm still a little unsure on the relationship between the actual medical tubing and the hurricane.
I wouldn't think about it as a direct line from the medical tubing to the hurricane so much as thinking about like all of these different sort of interconnected things that are happening, right? So the hurricane is the strength of those hurricanes are very much tied to climate crisis, right? Like hurricanes are getting stronger and dumping more water and causing significantly more destruction and causing destruction further inland. Like Asheville really shouldn't be getting major destructive hurricanes that are destroying so many people's livelihoods. But that is because of climate change. So that it's not a straight line. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one last really quick question, and then if you have any more questions, you can ask Tali afterwards. Go ahead. The very end.
Have you considered using compostable plastics?
Compostable? Is that what you asked? So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is using waste, like things that would otherwise have been discarded. But part of the point of incorporating the plastics was, so for a long time I had been using these like quote unquote natural materials, right? Like organic cotton and linen and plant-based dyes. And it felt like a sort of disingenuous way of actually engaging with the issue, like ignoring how complicated our relationships to these things really are, or how much plastic and fossil fuels were still a part of the work, even if it was invisible. And so it felt important to sort of put that directly into the work, that even if I'm using only, there's no way of like extracting myself completely from these systems, like making a artwork that is pure. I don't think there is. And so this felt like the way of trying to like tell a little bit more of the story.
Thank you. Let's go on.